There are moments whispered across the Imperium in tones so hushed, they scarcely disturb the dust upon a forgotten shrine. Moments imagined by soldiers who tremble beneath a sky lit by burning voidcraft and by pilgrims who have nothing left to offer but the bones in their hands. It begins as a question shared between the desperate and the damned. What shape would reality take if the master of mankind were to open his eyes once more? In the echoing basilicas of Terra, custodians stand like statues, while the golden throne murmurs its endless mechanical dirge, a machine older than any living soul can grasp. Beneath the roar of its reactors, beneath the churning rivers of psychers fed into its insatiable hunger, there lingers an impossibility, not prophecy, not promise, something more fragile, a thought that slips into the cracks of the universe like a sliver of light between closing doors. What happens when the Emperor finally wakes up? Some claim the Astronomicon itself would shift in color, in timbre, in cadence, as though human hope had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Others swear the change would be quieter, something felt rather than seen, a ripple through the subconscious of all who have ever spoken his name. And then there are those who believe it would end everything, that a god rising from a throne of agony would not bring salvation, but judgment. For 10,000 years, his silence has been a constant as immutable as the stars, an anchor that defines reality as much as gravity or time. The galaxy has learned to survive in the shadow of his immobility. But shadows are easily broken once light begins to move. So imagine, for a single fragile heartbeat, the sound of a breath drawn by the Emperor after millennia of stillness. Imagine the weight of that awakening pressing upon every mind in the galaxy, from the smallest hive-born child to the most ancient demon lurking beyond the veil. Imagine that silence becoming something else. If such a moment ever came, none, neither mortal, machine, nor warp-born entity, would escape its reach. If you wish to follow this journey into the heart of that question, if you want to see how far the implications of such an awakening can truly reach, then lend your voice to this chronicle. Like the litanies that echo in the chapels of the imperial palace, every shard of support strengthens the signal. So subscribe, share, and add your light to the Astronomicon so we may continue exploring the darkest possibilities and brightest horrors of Warhammer 40K. The first signs arrive without fanfare, without warning, without even the courtesy of a whisper, slipping instead into the marrow of those who have stood vigil for lifetimes beneath the arched vaults of the imperial palace, where the light is always dim and the air forever tinged with the metallic breath of ancient machinery. A custodian named Ethon, one of countless golden sentinels who have never once faltered in their sacred duty, feels it before he can give the sensation shape. It is not a sound, for none echo in these halls save the steady thrum of the Golden Throne's reactors. It is not a shift in the air, though a faint tremor runs through the marble beneath his armored feet. It is something more intimate, a pressure behind the sternum, as though the universe itself inhaled so subtly that only those forged for vigilance could detect it. He resists the instinct to turn his head, for custodians do not move without purpose, yet a flicker of unease curls through him like smoke. The throne looms ahead, a monument of cables and adamantine plating, its surface glowing with an almost sickly radiance as conduit after conduit feeds power into a machine that devours souls with the same inevitability as a star collapsing. Even at rest, it dominates the senses, its heat pressing against flesh and ceramite alike, its psychic field humming at a pitch just below conscious hearing. Tech adepts scurry about its foundations like insects tending a wounded titan, their mechadendrites clattering as they adjust regulators older than their genealogies. None look up, yet a ripple of hesitation freezes them for a breath, and Ethon knows he was not alone in feeling it. Something shifted. something unmistakable. But nothing in the chamber so much as twitches, not even the emperor's desiccated shell entombed in the throne's cruel embrace. Word spreads without words. Far above, in galleries carved with reliefs depicting humanity's triumphs and tragedies, other custodians pause mid-step, their spears angled like shafts of sunlight caught in amber. Initiates performing endless sweeps of consecrated corridors falter as the sensation rolls over them like a distant tremor. The constant drone of the throne deepens for half a second, too brief for mortal ears, too slight for auspex to register, yet profound enough that every psyker within 100 chambers feels their soul tighten. Ethan's breath catches as a faint brightness glimmers at the edge of his perception, not seen, not heard, but sensed as vividly as a hand placed upon his shoulder. The Emperor has not moved, not in 10,000 years, not even when Terra itself buckled under the rage of Abaddon's ruinous crusades. The throne has never faltered in this way, not once. And yet Ethan can feel the tremor echoing through him in slow waves, as though the static pressure of the chamber hides a second heartbeat beneath its usual rhythm. He forces the thought away with disciplined clarity, but the suspicion persists, like a bead of molten gold sinking through stone. Around the base of the throne, the Adeptus Mechanicus engineers begin arguing in curt, crackling Binharic exchanges, their voices modulating with anxiety they cannot hide beneath layers of ritualized calm. One tech priest runs a trembling auspex over a cable thicker than his torso, muttering liturgies of stabilization even as readings spike and fall with no discernible pattern. The most experienced among them, a magos whose face is a latticework of bionics, approaches a control lectern and places his metal fingers upon the runes. The panel responds sluggishly, as though the machine spirit within were struggling through a fog. He whispers a supplication to appease its temper, but even his carefully modulated tone betrays apprehension. Servitors wired into the throne's subsystems twitch in unison, their mouths emitting faint static as their blank minds momentarily brush some incomprehensible signal. Ethan watches the magos step back from the controls in near disbelief, and for the first time in centuries, he senses fear in the man. It is a small thing, but real, unmistakable. A hesitation in the motion of a mechadendrite, a fraction too slow in forming the next blessing. The tech priest knows something is wrong. The custodian knows it too. But neither can name it. Then the psychers feel it. The choir chambers directly beneath the throne erupt in discordant shrieks as bound psychers collapse against their restraints, eyes rolling back, tongues muttering fragmented visions that dissolve upon contact with sound. Their agony spirals up through the structure like rising smoke, thin but piercing, a psychic cry too faint for most to hear, yet shaking the consciousness of the few sensitive to its resonance. Ethan's gauntlets tighten around the haft of his guardian spear. The air thickens. The light wavers. For a moment, the shadows cast by the throne seem to lengthen toward him, reaching like the silhouettes of grasping hands. It passes in an instant, but the sensation lingers in the back of his mind, a phantom presence that was not there moments before. He glances at the Emperor, at the corpse that rules an empire, and feels a chill he dare not articulate. The body remains still, lips cracked, skin stretched thin over bone, eyes sealed, their sockets sunken, yet eternally watching through the psychic beacon projected by a will so immense it transcends mere flesh. And still Ethan feels the whisper of movement, not in muscle or sinew, but in the fabric of the air itself, as if something deep within that ancient shell had taken the slightest, most imperceptible breath. Pilgrims waiting in the outer shrines begin to weep without knowing why. Attendants quietly abandon their tasks, unsure whether to pray or flee. Even the custodians, those paragons of discipline, exchange minute glances that would be imperceptible to any other observers. Time stretches, the weight of the chamber settling over them like a burial shroud. Ethan's heartbeat slows to match the throne's endless mechanical cadence, the two rhythms momentarily overlapping so precisely he cannot distinguish them. A low resonance vibrates through his armor, humming along the engraved lines of the Emperor's sigils etched into its plates, filling him with a sensation that is neither warmth nor cold, neither pain nor relief. It is simply presence, a pressure, a weight, a gaze. He feels seen, not by the attendants, not by the magos, but by something older, deeper, and impossibly vast. He forces himself not to react, yet a thin line of sweat forms at his hairline beneath the helm's interior. His training keeps his posture perfect, but nothing in his centuries of existence has prepared him for the feeling that sweeps through him now, like the brushing of a titan's finger across the edges of his soul. Another tremor ripples through the chamber, stronger this time, shaking dust from the vaulted ceiling and rattling the reliquaries lining the alcoves. The Magos yells for stabilizer rights. Servitors lurch as sparks erupt from a bank of conduits. A low, keening sound rises from the psyker pits far below, not of physical pain, but of psychic pressure, as though something enormous has shifted in the warp and their fragile minds cannot endure its weight. Ethan steps forward, not in fear, but in readiness, his spear aligned with the calm precision of a master warrior. The light around the Emperor flickers, dims, then brightens for a fraction of a heartbeat. It is so quick, so faint, so utterly unexpected that most would dismiss it as a trick of the eye, but Ethan sees it. He knows he sees it. And in that instant he feels the sudden, shocking certainty that something on the throne is no longer as it was, not broken, not awakening, not yet, but stirring, as though millennia of silence have begun to shift beneath their own impossible weight, as though a being so powerful that its dreams sculpt reality has, for the briefest moment, brushed against consciousness. And in that breath of stillness, as the hum of the golden throne settles back into its eternal drone, Ethan realizes that the galaxy will feel this tremor soon, whether it wishes to or not. The first ripple reaches Terra long before any alarm is raised, moving not through vox lines or data streams, but through the fragile vessels of mortal perception, a pressure that slides beneath consciousness and blooms into awareness like an ache beneath old scar tissue. It begins in the shadowed arteries of the imperial palace, but its echo spreads outward with inexorable grace, slipping into the bones of a world already drowning beneath its own weight. Terra has always felt heavy, oppressive, a planet layered with history, death, and machinery, until even its air seems forged rather than breathed. But on this day, the heaviness acquires a new texture, an undertone that unsettles even those who have never known a moment of calm in their lives. Pilgrims crowding the steps of the ecclesiarchal shrines gasp as a tremor of emotion they cannot name sweeps through them, a sensation like remembering a grief they never lived. Some fall to their knees, clutching relics and prayer scrolls. Others simply stare up at the smog-thick sky, eyes wide, as though expecting it to split open. The stone beneath them vibrates with a subtlety so delicate it could be mistaken for the rumble of distant manufactura, yet none of them make that mistake. Something inside them recognizes the tremor as a thing apart, a note in a cosmic chord they were never meant to hear. High above, in spires of ormolu and adamantium where the air grows thin beneath gold-encrusted vaults, the High Lords of Terra receive the disturbance in fragmented reports, each more unsettling than the last. Data slates flicker with inexplicable static. Vox lines shiver with faint harmonic distortions. Adepts of the administratum exchange nervous glances across the vellum-strewn conference tables where bureaucratic order has reigned unchallenged for millennia. A single scribe faints as an unbidden vision flashes across his mind, a light rising beyond the walls of the palace, too bright to look upon. His superiors dismiss his episode as exhaustion, but their hands tremble as they sign the dismissal records. The lords themselves maintain poise, but beneath their formal robes each feels a faint but undeniable pulse, as if the heartbeat of Terra itself had stuttered and resumed with a slightly altered rhythm. They do not speak of it. Not yet. To give voice to the sensation would make it real, and none of them are prepared to confront the possibility of change radiating from the Golden Throne. Across the vast sprawl of the hive districts, the effect manifests more violently. Workers in the lower manufactura drop their tools as a sudden vertigo overtakes them, a wave of nausea that leaves them clutching the railings of assembly lines while servitors continue their silent, mechanical toil. The glow from lumen strips flickers in jagged patterns, casting shadows that dart across the walls like fleeing spirits. A foreman shouts orders to return to work, but the authority in his voice wavers, undermined by the same hollow feeling gnawing at his gut. Somewhere deep within the industrial labyrinth, a child cries out, not from pain, but from the sudden conviction that something vast has brushed its thoughts. The mother hushes the child, but her own heart races with nameless dread. Terra has never been a place of comfort, but the dread that coils through its population now has a different flavor. Less like fear of death, more like awe twisted by uncertainty. Astropaths across the planet suffer the disturbance with shocking intensity. Many collapse mid-signal, their frail bodies convulsing as psychic currents twist unpredictably around their soul-bound minds. One choirmaster, hardened by centuries of service, tears off his blindfold as a flash of unbearable luminescence invades his perception, a flare that is neither warp-sourced nor natural. He stumbles backward, whispering half-formed prayers to the Emperor, unable to determine whether the vision was benevolent or a warning. Psyker sanctuaries lock down within minutes as warding protocols surge into place, metal shutters slamming shut with the violence of a prison reacting to riot. Even within these shielded sanctums, the astropaths feel the echo of something stirring beyond the veil, a shift in the psychic beacon that underpins their very existence. They cling to their restraint thrones, trembling, uncertain whether salvation or annihilation is drawing nearer. At the edges of Terra's polluted oceans and desolate plains, the sensation becomes more erratic, manifesting as shuddering pulses in the atmosphere. Great storm systems hesitating in their destructive rotation, winged servitors malfunctioning mid-flight and spiraling into the dust-choked wind. The air tastes different, charged, metallic, almost like the scent of ozone before a thunderbolt strikes. In the spaceports, void ship crews readying for departure pause as their auspex arrays flicker with anomalous readings. A navigator aboard a departing ship jerks upright, every hair on her body standing on end as she perceives a subtle distortion in the Astronomican's familiar radiance. Not a diminishment, but a modulation, as though a new note had entered a melody unchanged for 10,000 years. She clutches the arm of a junior officer and whispers a question she immediately regrets. Did he move? The officer stares at her as if seeing a ghost. Neither speaks again. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Custodes begin to feel the spreading wave through their own psychic attunement to the palace. Those stationed at Terra's borders, far from the throne, stiffen as a sensation like a spear tip of warmth grazes their minds. They turn instinctively toward the distant glow of the imperial palace, its silhouette rising from the horizon like a wounded god straining against its bindings. Each custodian feels the shift with slight variations, some as a tightening of focus, others as a phantom hand pressing between the shoulder blades, still others as a whisper of consciousness brushing their thoughts before receding into the immensity of silence. They do not speak of it. Their discipline forbids speculation, but they share a single unspoken truth. Whatever occurred in the throne room is no longer contained within its walls. As day bleeds into evening, the sensation permeates every echelon of Terra's society. Pilgrims at the outer gates begin chanting spontaneously, their voices rising in uneven waves, as if responding to a call none can interpret. The Adeptus Arbites attempt to disperse the crowds forming around the ecclesiarchal shrines, but their commands falter when the pilgrims begin weeping openly, faces uplifted in rapture or terror. No one can tell which. Even the Arbites, armored in carapace and certainty, feel the faint tremor threading through their nerves. Some mutter that perhaps the Emperor is displeased. Others dare not voice their suspicion at all. By nightfall, rumors spread like wildfire. Someone claims to have seen a beam of light erupt from the top of the palace, completely false, yet repeated by thousands. Another insists that the Emperor's eyes opened, just for a second. 100 whispered stories sprout in the cracks of fear and hope, each feeding on the other until even the most skeptical administratum adepts feel a prickling along their spine when they pass a shrine or hear their own footsteps echo too loudly in a hall. Vox networks become unstable as strange pulses distort the channels, forcing operators to recalibrate equipment that should have been unchanged for centuries. One senior Vox engineer breaks protocol and locks down his station entirely after hearing, through layers of static, what he swears was a breath, one drawn not by man or machine, but by something immeasurably greater. And through all this, Terra itself seems to hold its breath. The predators of the underhives pause in their hunts. The bureaucrats of the upper tiers hesitate before stamping seals upon their documents. The faithful gather in trembling circles, reciting litanies as though their lives depended on every syllable. Above them all, the palace looms like a wounded colossus, its vast shadow stretching across the hives and manufactura, a reminder of the god who sits unmoving upon its throne. Yet on this day, that stillness feels less absolute, less eternal, as if something behind the curtain of immobility has shifted, so quietly that only the most attuned souls can sense it, yet profoundly enough that the entire world responds. For Terra is bound to its emperor in ways even its inhabitants cannot fathom, and now, like a creature sensing the flicker of its master's awakening, the planet waits. Breath held, heart trembling, mind caught between fear and desperate hope. The tremor that began in silence has now become a world's question, poised on the edge of revelation. Across the void, far from Terra's trembling surface and the suffocating, incense-choked air of the imperial palace, the Astronomicon begins to waver with a subtlety that only those attuned to its psychic heartbeat can perceive, a disturbance so delicate it might be mistaken for the faint flutter of a distant star. Yet for those whose survival depends upon its stability, the change strikes like a tremor through the soul. On the command deck of the Imperial Navy cruiser, Gilded Revelation, the navigator Lady Sarastra Val stiffens in her throne as the familiar psychic beacon, normally a steadfast column of blinding brilliance piercing the warp's roiling madness, flickers with a distortion that feels less like dimming and more like a shifting of intent. The light is still there, still immeasurable, still overwhelming in its radiant force, but its cadence wavers, as if the will behind it has paused mid-thought. She opens her lidless third eye, the mutation crowning her brow blooming like a wound of shimmering iridescence, and what she perceives forces a shudder down her spine. The beacon's frequency spirals through unfamiliar harmonics, weaving threads of resonance she has never felt in a lifetime of navigating. The warp around it reacts like a living thing touched by something alien, recoiling first in confusion, then pressing inward as though drawn by curiosity or hunger. Sarastra slams her eye shut, gasping, the phantom afterimage lingering as a complex lattice of impossible geometry. Her attendants rush to her side, but she waves them away with trembling fingers, refusing to voice what she suspects, for to speak the thought aloud would invite madness. The Astronomicon, is not fluctuating due to failure. It is fluctuating due to change. Across a dozen sector-spanning distances, other navigators experience their own tormented fragments of this phenomenon. A scion of House Ulthenius aboard the pilgrim vessel, Merciful Dawn, collapses mid-chart, his third eye burning with visions of a golden shape shifting behind a veil of roaring flame. A rogue navigator hiding among the black ships claws at her face, convinced she feels a presence brushing the edges of her mind, neither cruel nor kind, simply immense. Choirs of astropaths cry out in unison across the segmentum solar, their voices rasping with shared hallucinations that transmit through psychic echo rather than vox. 1,000 telepaths choke on the same impossible image, a throne sizzling with lightning, a silhouette blurred by starfire, and a single breath drawn in silence so absolute that it shatters their waking thoughts. Their handlers cannot calm them. Their restraints strain under the convulsions. Their minds are not breaking from pain, but from awe twisted into terror, an emotional vertigo that feels like stepping too close to a cliff's edge and realizing the cliff is staring back. Imperial fleets scattered across the void falter as navigators request immediate course corrections, their voices tight with controlled panic. The captains, hardened veterans of void combat, accustomed to maintaining discipline even in the face of demonic incursions, exchange uneasy glances. Warp charts that have remained unchanged for generations begin to fill with red ink annotations and frantic recalculations. The warp's storms do not surge or swell, but shift, subtly, unnervingly, as though the currents are adjusting around a new gravitational center. On the bridge of the battle barge, indomitable wrath, a librarian senses the warp's altered resonance rippling through his gene-enhanced soul. He grips the railing until it dents beneath his gauntlet, feeling a pressure like a colossal hand pressing against the bubble of reality surrounding their vessel. He whispers a prayer to the Emperor that catches in his throat, for he feels something else rising beneath the words, a sensation like standing in the presence of a force that has finally turned its gaze outward after millennia of inward stillness. In quieter corners of the Imperium, far-flung outposts that orbit dead suns or cling to the edges of nebulae, astropathic choirs experience distorted fragments of an echo none can interpret. A message transmitted from Terra emerges torn, half-formed, filled with harmonics that twist the meaning into blurred metaphor. The psychers perceiving it describe the sensation as the psychic equivalent of seeing a reflection ripple when a stone drops into a calm lake. A training cohort of novice astropaths on the moon colony of Helion Primus begins sobbing uncontrollably mid-lesson, their instructor rushing to shield them as dissonant pulses vibrate through the warp, pulses that feel like a heartbeat slowing, then strengthening, then pausing entirely before resuming with a new rhythm. One initiate faints, mumbling that the light is turning, but cannot explain what she means. The instructor does not report the anomaly, choosing instead to lock down the sanctum and perform protective rites until the sensation subsides. And still the disturbance spreads. On rogue trader vessels, psychers recoil from their divination rituals, claiming that their visions no longer follow familiar patterns. The threads of fate blur, refract, splinter. One claims he saw the same future 3 times, but with 3 different endings. Another claims he saw no future at all, only a blinding presence blocking his sight like a shield raised against prophecy. The crew laughs nervously at this, muttering that psychers see demons in their breakfast bowls, but their laughter dissipates quickly, thin and uneasy. Even those without psychic sensitivity feel a strange pressure in the air, like an unseen storm building just beyond the bulkheads. Across the segmentum obscurus, where the warp's influence is often thick as fog, the fluctuations strike with particularly violent clarity. Astropathic relays flicker with static resembling whispered syllables no one can fully decipher. The officers in charge of these stations stare at the recordings afterward, unsettled by how close the sounds resemble a breath, long, slow, measured, drawn not in desperation, but in contemplation. It cannot be the emperor, they insist. The throne does not breathe. The machine does not falter. The astronomicon does not change. They repeat these truths like mantras, but the warp does not heed them. Something within its depths is moving, subtly altering its texture, like ripples forming around a submerged leviathan turning in its sleep. Even the Inquisition feels the shift. In a fortress monastery hidden within an asteroid field, an inquisitor pores over reports with increasing irritation, dismissing most as hysteria, but unable to ignore the shared patterns threading through them. Psychers speaking of new harmonics, navigators reporting unfamiliar geometries, warp charts requiring revisions after centuries of reliability. None of this fits with established doctrine. None of this should be possible unless the source of the Astronomicon itself had changed. She refuses to voice the thought that forms like ice along her nerves, for even to consider it borders on heresy. Yet the reports pile higher, each echoing the same unspoken truth. The Imperium's lighthouse is no longer the same lighthouse. And still, the warp reacts. Demons ripple at the edges of unreality, sniffing the psychic wind as a new vibration sweeps across their roiling domains. Warp predators shift direction. Tides of unreality eddy and swirl with hesitant fascination. Something is happening to the beacon they have feared and hated for 10,000 years. Something subtle, something profound, something that makes even the most ancient among them pause and listen. Aboard thousands of void ships, across hundreds of sectors, in the minds of psychers, navigators, and warp-touched souls scattered like dust across the galaxy, the same realization crawls slowly into consciousness. The Astronomicon is not failing, it is changing, and no one knows whether that change heralds salvation or doom. Far above Terra, where the thin shroud of atmosphere gives way to the cold, star-stung void, the golden brilliance of the Astronomicon pulses again. But this time the fluctuation is neither subtle nor fleeting, and its shockwave rolls outward with the force of a silent scream, rattling the very skin of reality as it races across the segmentum solar. Aboard the silent orbiting defense bastion, Eternus Vigil. Every sensor crystal, auspex array, and esoteric psi relay flares with warnings, as if the station itself has suddenly gained a heartbeat, its machine spirits keening in confusion as fluctuations devour their calibration matrices. Within its reinforced sanctum, tech priest Magos Epsilon 9 Varak jerks his mechadendrites toward the blinding spike of impossible data cascading across his rune screen. His flesh eye dilating wildly as he whispers a quavering scrap code prayer, not in fear of malfunction, but in awe of the sheer magnitude of what he is witnessing. The Astronomicon's psychic frequency, normally constant as the Emperor's eternal will, surges upward with a new resonance so complex that his noospheric mind struggles to parse it. A resonance layered like a choir of voices singing in dissonant unison, voices that should not exist, cannot exist, yet ring through the warp with impossible clarity. He initiates a deep diagnostic sweep, invoking ancient protocols older than the Imperium itself, but the results return only cascading strings of contradictory logic, a paradox of measurements indicating both catastrophic failure and perfect, transcendent efficiency in the same impossible breath. Varak's pulse hitches. He recognizes a pattern embedded within the flux, a repeating algorithm woven into the psychic flare like a heartbeat hidden beneath a storm. It is not a decline. It is not a collapse. It is an awakening. At that same moment on Terra, deep within the catacombs beneath the imperial palace, the Adeptus Custodes stand rigid as statues before the Eternity Gate, their auramite armor glowing faintly as if reacting to an unseen presence, their spears humming with a low subsonic vibration that has no mechanical source. Captain General Trajan Valoris himself pauses mid-stride atop the Dawnhall steps, his helm beneath his arm, his gaze narrowing as he feels something shift within the air. Not wind, not pressure, but a psychic tremor that skates across the surface of his gene-crafted soul like a blade of warm light. He turns his eyes toward the distant silhouette of the palace's highest spires, where the light of the Astronomicon burns brightest. His expression tightens. In 10,000 years, he has felt variations, surges, and brief instabilities, each swiftly corrected by the Golden Throne's mechanisms and the daily sacrifice of countless psychers. But he has never felt this. The tremor is not a cry of pain. It is not a failing sigh. It is intention, purpose, direction, a shifting of weight like a slumbering titan rolling from one side to another. He does not voice the thought forming in his mind. No custodian would dare. But the silence between his heartbeats stretches taut with the gravity of revelation. Far below, in the cavernous black cells where the daily procession of psyker sacrifices shuffle toward their ordained oblivion, the air crackles with psychic static as hundreds of doomed souls simultaneously stiffen, their pale faces lifting in unnatural unison, as if hearing a sound no mortal ear could perceive. A low, resonant hum fills the chamber, vibrating up through the marble floor like the tolling of a colossal submerged bell. The guards step back, raising their shock staves warily. But the psychers do not scream or convulse as they sometimes do. Instead, they stare upward, toward the ceiling, toward the throne, toward him, with expressions not of terror, but of awareness. One whispers through torn lips, "He is listening." Another, weeping, adds, "He moves." These words should have triggered immediate alarm, yet the guards find their throats frozen, their thoughts numbed by the psychic tide washing over them. Even the Null Maidens patrolling the perimeter pause, their pariah auras flickering for the briefest impossible moment, like candles guttering in a sudden draft. Across the entirety of the palace, astropathic choirs collapse mid-chant, not from agony, but from an overwhelming influx of layered signals that surge through their minds like tidal waves of golden fire. They are not messages. They are impressions, shapes, sensations, half-formed memories not their own. A towering presence standing within a sea of blinding radiance. A hand stretching toward distant stars. A breath drawn with quiet deliberation. A vision of a horizon splitting with dawn. Many who receive the visions die instantly, their souls burned clean by the magnitude of the contact. Others survive, trembling, babbling incoherently about a figure wreathed in flame whose face they could not bear to look upon. The master of the astropaths orders the complex sealed, his voice shaking even as he tries to maintain composure. He knows that if these visions spread, panic would erupt across Terra, and panic within the heart of the Imperium is a heresy even he cannot allow. Meanwhile, on Luna, in the secret vault beneath the Scholastica Psychana, the Inquisition convenes an emergency council. Hollow projections flicker above the obsidian table, displaying synchronized reports from dozens of sectors, navigators experiencing identical geometric distortions, psychers collapsing with the same visions, warp patterns shifting around the Astronomicon's psychic signature as if reacting to a new gravitational center. Inquisitor Lord Risa Draver slams her gauntlet against the table, her patience unraveling as she demands an explanation that no one can give. A timid savant suggests the unthinkable, that the throne has altered its output. But Draver cuts him off with a glare. "The Emperor does not change," she snaps. "He endures." Yet even as she says the words, her voice lacks conviction. The data before her refuses to be silenced. Something is happening within the Golden Throne, something real, measurable, undeniable. And if the Emperor is not the cause, then something far, far worse must be. But within the warp itself, the truth is far more profound. Demons as old as the birth of humanity flinch as waves of light ripple through their domains, warping the tides of unreality with a force so immense it makes their forms waver and blur. The changer of ways stirs with restless irritation. The prince of excess purrs with hungry curiosity. The blood god snarls as the light scours the edges of his realm, while the plague lord pauses his idle experiments, feeling the tremor pass through his rotted gardens like a warm breeze. The Astronomicon has been their enemy for millennia, a weapon of order in a sea of chaos. But this is different. It is not merely brighter. It is not merely stronger. It is conscious, in a way, across the dreaming vastness of the warp, where tides of madness churn like molten galaxies and thoughts take the shape of predatory beasts. A single pulse of radiant force sweeps outward as if carried on the heartbeat of a slumbering god, distorting everything it touches. Demons recoil like shadows struck by sudden dawn. Psychic currents buckle and twist, and ancient warp entities older than the Imperium lift their shifting faces toward the source of the disturbance, sensing not merely power, but direction, a focus they have not felt since the days when the Emperor walked among mortal men. On Terra itself, the Golden Throne groans with tectonic strain, its machine spirits howling with a chorus of metallic voices as though centuries of dust and silence have been shaken loose from its bones. A halo of raw psychic brilliance blossoms around the seated form of the Emperor, illuminating the throne chamber with a radiance unseen since the heresy, casting long, jagged shadows across the adamantine pillars and gleaming off the armor of the custodian guard who now stand rigid, their souls braced against the rising storm. Many would swear that the Emperor remains motionless, that he is exactly as he has been for 10,000 years. Yet they cannot ignore the tremors coursing through the air, the subtle pressure building in their minds, the sense of a presence coiling tighter and tighter upon itself, like a star preparing to ignite. The Astronomicon, once steady as a metronome, now pulses with a breath-like rhythm, expanding and contracting with deliberate cadence, sending ripples through the warp that distort the paths of starships halfway across the galaxy. In the shadowed catacombs beneath the palace, where the black ships deliver their endless tithe of psychers, the daily sacrifice halts without command as every single offering collapses to their knees, their eyes rolling back as visions pour into their minds with blinding intensity. Visions of fractured futures in flux. Some see Terra burning under a sky lit by impossible auroras. Others see the Emperor rising from his throne in a blaze of light that melts their sanity. A few blessed or cursed souls claim they see him walking not as the radiant god of imperial myth, but as the weary warlord he once was, striding alone through a field of fallen demigods as storm clouds churn overhead. Whether these visions are truth or delusion, no one can say. Even the inquisitors summoned to witness the event find their certainty crumbling as the psychic echoes reverberate through the chamber like aftershocks of a divine awakening. When the last psyker falls silent, their minds spent, a hush settles over the room, a hush heavy with expectation, as though the very stones of Terra are listening for footsteps that have not sounded in millennia. Across the segmentum solar, astropaths cry out as their inner sight is overwhelmed by a torrent of luminous impressions, shifting constellations forming symbols older than the Imperium, winged silhouettes sweeping across nebulae, a burning crown suspended in the void, and always, always, the sensation of someone searching, reaching across the warp with purpose, sharpened into a spear point. Navigators aboard void ships experience simultaneous visions of a colossal figure standing within the Astronomican's core, wreathed in spiraling gold, his eyes opening to reveal galaxies reflected in their depths. Many survive only because their third eyes snap shut in self-defense, but even so, they weep uncontrollably, claiming they have felt something they never imagined possible. Not command, not judgment, but awareness. Far from Terra, in the apocalyptic tomb world shadows of the Necrons, stasis crypts flicker in agitation. In orc-held sectors, wah! Fields surge unexpectedly, triggering frenzied brawls as the greenskins feel a pressure they lack the words to name. Tyrannid synapse networks twist and recoil, their hive minds screeching with collective unease. Even the craft worlds shudder as their farseers reel from psychic fractures racing through the skein of fate. It is as if the Emperor's shifting presence has pulled a tangled tapestry taut, altering the flow of possibility across the stars. Some outcomes strengthen, others crumble, entire destinies wither to dust. Within the secret vaults of the Inquisition, panic teeters beneath the surface of every whispered conversation. Reports flood in from 100,000 worlds, each describing phenomena that should be impossible. Non-psychers experiencing prophetic dreams, heretical cults suddenly silenced without explanation, dormant relics emitting faint glows, the immobile bodies of ancient saints momentarily exhaling ghostly breaths. Inquisitor Lord Dravera, who once dismissed the idea of change as superstition, now studies the pulsating readings before her with hollow eyes. She cannot deny what is happening, but she fears the implications more than any demon. If the Emperor is moving, then all doctrines written upon the bedrock of his supposed stillness begin to crack. The ecclesiarchy trembles at the thought. The Mechanicus grapples with existential crisis. The High Lords convene in desperate secrecy, their voices a tapestry of fear, hope, denial, and speculation. Yet every political argument feels meaningless in the face of the phenomenon unfolding above their heads, where the palace spires shimmer with the reflection of warp light bleeding through the atmosphere. But the strangest changes occur within the warp itself. Its tides, once violently resistant to the Emperor's influence, now ripple with something almost like recognition. Not submission, never submission, but attention. As though the immaterium, in all its infinite fractured malice, senses a familiar presence stirring. Some demons flee instinctively, unable to bear the brilliance radiating through their realms. Others gather like vultures in orbit around a storm, curious whether this awakening heralds opportunity or annihilation. The four great powers shift subtly at the edges of their kingdoms, ancient rivalries quieting as each contemplates a question none dare ask aloud. What happens when their greatest adversary changes? Back on Terra, Custodian Valerian, introduced previously, stands upon the Eternity Gate, his spear clenched in a gauntleted hand as he stares at the distant gleam of the Astronomican's core through the crystalline skylight above. He has served the Emperor his entire life. He has memorized every doctrine, every litany, every fragment of testimony. He has never allowed himself to feel hope. Hope is for mortals. Hope is for the uncertain. A custodian does not hope. A custodian obeys. Yet now, something ancient within him stirs, something he has suppressed for centuries. He feels not just duty, but anticipation. A memory rises unbidden, a vision of the Emperor as he once was, striding through the palace halls, his presence heavier than gravity itself. Valerian wonders, for the first time in his existence, whether he might see that figure again, whether he might stand in his shadow not as a guardian of a corpse throne, but as a shield-bearer of a living god. At the heart of the golden throne, beneath layers of machinery, psychic pylons, and reality-stabilizing fields, the Emperor's ravaged body remains bound to his sacred prison. Yet for the first time in 10,000 years, a breath moves through the warp in perfect rhythm with the flickering light of his eyes, not a waking breath, not yet, but a breath that suggests the machinery tethering him may no longer be holding back a fading ember, but may instead be struggling to contain a rising flame. Across the galaxy, every soul touched by the warp feels the same message, carried on currents of golden light as soft as whispered prayer. He is coming back. But not as we expect.